The village in it with a map and a plan. No place too tiny for this determined man. Crossing the counties one by one, you'll see in every English corner a bit of history.
Hello folks, it's been a while, but finally we're back in Bradford. We haven't been here for a long time. Now, we've got 12 left to do in this part of West Yorkshire, and this is probably one of the smallest ones that remain, to be honest with you, and that's going to seem strange when you look at how big this episode is as a whole. They're all really big in Bradford. Here, we're outside some old mills. Those are Greenholme mills. Now, we know mills are very important in this part of West Yorkshire, don't we? Let's learn about these as we travel around the parish of Burley. Burley, fort in a wood. Hello Bradford, where have you been? It's been ages since we touched this bit of West Yorkshire. In fact, it was almost 2 years ago. That's mental. Anyway, we're back and we're in a place called Burley in Wharfedale. The official name of the parish this sits in is simply Burley. This is a big village, there's no two ways about it. It lies on the River Wharfe just to the west of Otley, between it and the town of Ilkley. The parish includes the hamlet of Burley Woodhead, which is at the foot of Burley Moore, a vast expanse of unspoilt land that stretches into the Pennines. The name Burley in Wharfedale is first recorded in a charter dated 972 AD. It literally means fort in a wood. Wharfedale was later added to avoid ambiguity with the various other English places of the same name. It might be a massive village these days, but it was once a small agricultural community with Roman and Anglo-Saxon roots. It developed greatly in the late 18th and 19th centuries into an industrial powerhouse thanks to Greenholme mills. They were cotton mills powered by a goit fed by the River Wharfe. They no longer operate and have recently been converted into flats, but the goit is still in use. It's now used to provide hydroelectric power, and a weir remains nearby. Major changes then came to the village in the early 20th century. Council housing was built and Burley became a dormitory settlement for the two cities of Leeds and Bradford. Now there's loads to discuss here, so we better get cracking and get on with it. This is Burley in Wharfedale. Enjoy. Let's get cracking with what are perhaps Burley's most important buildings, Greenholme Mills. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution would transform the once tiny agricultural community of Burley and Wharfedale into a thriving powerhouse. In 1790, Jonas Whittaker and partners built the first cotton mill in Burley. It was powered by a weir across the River Wharfe, and 21 years later, more mills were added. By 1833, some 360 people were employed here, mostly pauper apprentices from London. In 1850, two men named William, Messrs Fyson and Forster, bought the mills and converted them to worsted production. The mills employed over 700 people by the late 19th century, when the population of the village reached a whopping 3,000. That was astronomical for that time period. Burley's mills were unusual in the area because they handled the entire process of turning raw sheep's wool into finished fabric. From the mills, the workers would walk up Iron Row to reach their homes. We'll be walking up Iron Row later, following in the footsteps of the hundreds of folk who made Burley what it is today. The mills didn't cease production fully until 1966. In that year, Greenholme Mill, which still worked cotton, was forced out of business thanks to a fire. Today, the mills are still here, but they've not spun cotton for a long time. They're now residential apartments. The goit, the stream which was used to power them, is still here too. In 2010, Derwent Hydropower and TradeLink Solutions developed a turbine that made use of it in order to generate electricity from the old mill race. Okay, so now we're in Burley itself. We've come away from Greenholme Mills and it's just starting to get light now, so the light will come to me as I walk around this place. It should take me about 2 hours, I think, to get around Burley, so yeah, we better get cracking. There's loads to see here. First of all, we're going down there towards the church. Our main walk starts at what's probably the second most important building in Burley, St Mary's Parish Church. This one's history starts with the Chapel of Ease, which stood on the same site in the 15th century. It was replaced by the Fairfax Chapel in the 17th century, and that in turn was later pulled down and a new foundation stone was laid. 2 years later, the new church was opened and consecrated by the Bishop of Ripon. In 1856, St Mary's officially became a parish church, with Dr Charles Ingham Black installed as its first priest. He's remembered for penning the words to the carol "'Twas in the Cold Winter", and that is depicted in a memorial window here today. Changes have been made to the church over the years. Gas lighting was introduced in 1858, and following a fire in 1870, the church was renovated with donations from Fyson and Forster, as well as the owner of the Grange, Thomas Emsley. More on that in a bit. In 1952, the stalls, pulpit and altar rail were replaced with ones from the workshop of renowned Yorkshire furniture maker Robert Mousey Thompson, and yes, there are some mice to be found in this one. Also within the church is the Cresswell chest. It dates from 1630, and because of its value, it has to be kept locked in the vicar's vestry. Made of oak, it has 3 locks and 3 different keys. One was held by the lord of the manor, another by the incumbent, and the third by a gentleman of the village. Next to the church is Burley Hall. This was built in 1832 and is at least the third hall to occupy this site. John Pullin built one of the previous halls in 1630. The hall was the centrepiece of Burley Manor. In 1795, the whole of Burley Manor was put up for auction by Thomas Pullin Mosley. 2/3 was bought by the Greenholme Mills partners. It included most of the properties in the village and all of the land from Main Street to the mills. The remaining third, comprising Burley Hall, the Corn Mill, Burley Home and Burley Moore, were bought by Matthew Wilson of Otley. He sold the hall to a relative, Reverend Thomas Furness Wilson. That hall was destroyed by a fire in 1822, but was eventually rebuilt in the form we know today, some 10 years later. After World War II, Burley Hall was sold to the local authority for use as a residential home for the elderly. It still has that sort of same function now, except today it's owned by Bupa instead. Now we're in an area just to the south of the church and the hall. This is known as Post Office Yard, and it consists of a row of former shops and cottages. These have previously been known as Hell's Mouth and Elm Tree Place. Shops here have included, at various times, a druggist, a greengrocer's, a cobbler's and an antique shop. Next to the windows of one of the old shops is a wooden post, which used to be part of the village stocks. In the 1860s, this would have been the most densely populated part of the village. Although the post office is long gone, the postbox here remains in use to this day. In front of Post Office Yard is the pudding tree. This isn't the original pudding tree. That had to be felled in 1970 because it was considered to be dangerously rotten. It was replaced though with this attractive sycamore instead. The pudding tree gets its name thanks to a local event. It was here where until 1787 an annual feast was held. At it, a huge pudding weighing 60 stones, that's just over 380 kilograms in today's money, was eaten. 30 stones of it was flour and the other 30 was fruit. That's one big pudding. Nearby is the Malt Shovel. This used to be a humble 2-storey affair with a thatched roof. The opening of Burley's railway station though led to an increase in tourists to the area, so in an effort to capitalise on that, in 1880 the Malt Shovel was replaced by a 3-storey building that boasted a large coffee room capable of seating 100 people. A 1904 advert talked of the hotel's spacious bedrooms, choice wines and spirits, and cigars of the finest brands. In later years, the Malt Shovel operated as a pub and a bar and a restaurant before being developed into housing in 2014. So quite a lot in a small area there, and there's still loads more to see here in Burley. We better get motoring because this route, like I said, is about 2 hours long. So we're going to walk down the main street, which is this here. Next to see is the village green. This is the village green, which has been the focal point of Burley for at least the last 30 years. Records show it once had a blacksmith shop, which was in use until the 1930s, but not a lot is known about its ancient history. For most of the 20th century, the open area wasn't much more than just a wasteland, but between 1996 and 1999, it was re-landscaped with the help of donations from businesses and fundraising efforts. As marked by a plaque at the entrance to the green today, this was the site of a horrific incident in 1944 when a lorry coming from Ilkley and transporting members of the 6th Canadian Infantry Reinforcement Unit failed to take the sharp bend at the Malt Shovel and crashed into 26 Main Street. The scene was described by an eyewitness as being like a plane crash. All but one of the 21 men in the lorry died. The Methodist Church next. Methodism probably arrived in Burley in the 18th century, but it wasn't until 1816 that the Burley Wesleyan Society built a chapel here. That building is now the Cliff House Day Nursery, which was later enlarged in 1832. As the chapel approached its 50th year, the congregation decided to build a new place of worship, and that brings us to the current building. The foundation stone of this was dedicated on June 7th, 1867. The total cost, which included fitting it out with its pews, organ, stained glass windows, heating and lighting, came to £3,700. The architects were Lockwood and Mawson, who also designed the Town Hall and Wool Exchange in Bradford. As a result of the Methodist Church Union Act, the Primitives and Wesleyans were united in 1933, but they continued to function separately here for a while. The church became the place of worship for all of Burley's Methodists in 1967. Next we have the lawn. This piece of open ground was the literal lawn of a house. It was first occupied by William Brayshaw, who was a stuff or worsted manufacturer associated with the mills. In the 1920s it was owned by Walter Jackson. It came up for sale in 1956 and was acquired by the former Ilkley Urban District Council, who converted it into sheltered accommodation for 23 elderly people. 10 houses were built in the grounds, and a pedestrian footpath known as Lawn Walk was added through the garden to give the village a public open space in its centre. Remember, this is before the village green had been developed, so I guess you could say this was the original. Control of the property was passed to the Ayr Wharf Housing Trust after the turn of the century, and the house was redeveloped into small apartments. Now we're on Iron Row. This row of cottages was built in around 1800 by Greenwood and Whittaker for their workers at Greenholme Mills. Iron Row was previously called New Row, and it's not really clear why the name changed. Tradition has it though that iron doors were added to the properties in the early 19th century. This was done to protect them against attacks by Luddites, the bands of workers who we met back in Ruddington, who were angry that new mill machinery was taking their traditional framework knitting jobs away. The Luddites never actually made it any further than Addingham, where an attack on Low Mill in 1926 led to the deaths of 3 people. That event, however, put Burley on high alert, with a request for protection put into the Yorkshire Hussars in Leeds. In the 1851 census, there were 112 people recorded as living in the 20 cottages, with as little as 3 people in some and as many as 10 in others. Iron Row still leads to the mills on foot, but by car it's impassable. There's now a new bypass in the way, as well as the main recreation ground. Queen's Hall was formerly a lecture hall. It was built for the village by the mill owners in 1868 as a place for recreational pursuits. The eastern end of the building was used as Greenholme Mills schools until 1897. The building remained the property of William Feiston & Co. until it was bought by the former Burley Urban District Council in 1935 for £3,600. The two crosses standing in front of the hall were erected by the people of the village in remembrance of the two Williams, Feiston and Forster. Unless you count the Malt Shovel, we've so far not seen a pub. That's all about to change. Here we have the Queen's Head, which some locals simply refer to as Queen's instead. This is an old coaching inn that was extensively refurbished and reopened in October 2018 as an upmarket gastro-style bar. The layout is open plan, but there's effectively two distinct areas within. There's a main lounge which contains a bar, whilst a smaller room is located to the left. Although the bar focuses on food, it's also suitable for those who are just wanting a drink. It can be busy at weekends, this one, especially on Sundays. It has 5 individual apartments too, which are let on a nightly or weekly basis and can be booked via Airbnb. Dogs are welcomed in the smaller of the 2 rooms too, by the way. Now, I'm not one for advocating a pub crawl. There are plenty of people out there on YouTube and Facebook who can do that for you. But I reckon Burley is not a bad place, actually, if you do fancy a drink or two, because as well as the Queen's, you've also got the Red Lion, which is behind us there. Let's talk about that next. Pubs are like London buses here. You know the catchphrase, I'm sure. This one's called the Red Lion. This was originally a cottage-type inn. The 1851 census tells us there was a resident brewer employed by the publican of the time, Elizabeth Brumfitt. Whitaker's Brewery of Bradford acquired the pub in 1891 and rebuilt it in the form we know it today in 1893. They owned it until 1959, when a business takeover saw it fall into the hands of Tetleys of Leeds. The land behind the Red Lion used to be the venue for the Burley Feast, which was still celebrated well into the 1920s. Organised by the Salem Chapel, it was held on the nearest Sunday to October the 11th and featured a fair with roundabouts, swing boats and coconut shies. It had a marquee for dancing and exhibitions too. Speaking of the Salem Church, that's not far away. Officially, this is known as the Salem Congregational Chapel. It was built in 1840 by John Peele Clapham, the owner of Bly Grange at that time. Clapham had fallen out with the elders of the existing churches in Burley, so took matters into his own hands and built an independent chapel, an associated church hall, and a schoolroom in the grounds of his own house. The school could take up to 300 children, and it was located in the church hall behind the Queen's Head. Between the chapel and the hall is a graveyard containing around 600 graves and the Clapham family tomb. So where is Burley Grange? Well, it's here. Clapham built the Grange as a private house in early 1840. The residence was originally surrounded by high walls, and a section of those still remain today between a postbox and the St Mary's Parish Centre on Station Road. Extensive alterations were made to both the property and the grounds in the 1860s by Thomas Emsley, a wealthy landed gentleman who took over from Clapham as owner. After the death of the next owner, James Hodson, the house stood empty for a bit. Burley Urban District Council bought the property in 1904 and altered it to provide a suite of offices. The high walls were removed and replaced with railings, and the rear part of the property was used as the Grange Club, which ran until 1992. You'll note the railings are not here anymore either. They too were removed during World War II because iron was needed for munitions. In later times, the Grange was used to host adult education courses by the Bradford and Ilkley Community College. They vacated the Grange in 2006 and sold it to Alan Hayes in 2009. He would convert the upper floors to apartments and the ground floor to offices, and that's how it stayed ever since. Okay, so on the next corner there's a roundabout, and we'll be seeing some more pubs and things along this road shortly. First of all though, we have something called the Fountain of Life. The Fountain of Life. Now, this has got some inscriptions on it. I'm not quite sure which way to read it, but let's see. The Fountain of Life. Hold on. Oh, right, so it starts from there. With thee is the Fountain of Life. And there's something on the bottom as well. It says given in 1885. Nice little landmark that, isn't it? The last pub on the walk is the White Horse. This is just up the street from the Burley Tap. It's a small but lively single-roomed local pub which is accessed via a corridor off the main road. Unlike its near neighbour, it has a more traditional feel with tiled floors, a beamed ceiling and a coal fire. It can also boast some stained glass windows which are evidence of its previous ownership by the Melbourne Brewery. Burley's locals see this as the go-to place for live sports, and that figures. For many, many years, the White Horse has had a connection to horse racing. Between 1864 and 1874, Burley itself held annual horse racing events on a track between Bradford Road and Eastfield Lane. The races included the Innkeeper's Plate, the Wharfedale Handicap and the Steward's Cup. Thousands of spectators used to attend from the nearby towns and cities. This next street is called Peele Place. In 1858, number 4 was the birthplace of William Watson. He was raised in Liverpool from the age of 2 and went on to be a poet of some distinction. As such, he has a plaque of remembrance outside the Queen's Hall. This is also the street where the primitive Methodists once had a chapel. It was built in 1856 and was in use until 1890, when a new chapel and a school was built at the junction of Victoria Road and Sun Lane. The building on Peele Place then became a co-op and stayed that way for over 70 years. Today it's now a specialised joinery business. Peele Place also once had Victoria Hall, which was alternatively known as the Drill Hall. Its main purpose was to train volunteer soldiers before World War I. It was also used as a cinema in the 1940s and 50s, but was demolished in the early 1960s. Today, the site of the hall is now occupied by the Scout Hut. We might have run out of pubs, but there is still a club to see. This originally opened in 1913 when its premises included a shooting range that was in use until well after the end of World War II. Even though it's now purely a social club, most people still refer to it locally as the Rifle Club. Rebuilt in the early 1970s and recently remodelled, the club rooms now include a large concert room with a stage and a small dance floor. The club also boasts a games room too, which includes a snooker table. So why did it have a rifle range? Well, when it opened, it was associated with the National Miniature Rifle Association. It proved to be quite useful during World War II because it was the ideal place for the local Home Guard to use as a practice facility. Okay, so we've been going just over an hour, which is about right because we are about halfway around. We've now got a residential area to pass through before we head onto Station Road, where we catch the last batch of landmarks. And beyond that, it's kind of then sparse because all the remaining landmarks are sort of all over the place. So yeah, this should be quicker for me, but a little less interesting for you. Station Road now, and this is the St Mary's Parish Centre. In effect, it's like the village hall. It was built in 2007 and it's managed totally by a team of volunteers. In much the same way as any village hall, it offers activities and services for the village's residents and visitors. It's child-friendly and has full disabled access and facilities. Within its walls is the parish office, which is open every weekday morning from 9:30 to 11:30. Now we've come around the corner and we're at the library. Burley has had at least 4 libraries in its time. This one opened in 1974, replacing a former version that was inside Bly Grange. The first known library in the village was in Greenholme Mills, established well before the time of Fison and Forster. There was another in the Mechanics Institute too, which stood roughly where the fountain is at the bottom of Station Road. Next, we've got a couple of sports facilities. This is the Bowls Club, which was established just after World War II. This, the present Crown Green, was constructed in 1952. The clubhouse here is known as the Postlethwaite Pavilion. It opened in 2020 and it's named in remembrance of a long-standing club member, Philip Postlethwaite. It replaced the Shakespeare Memorial Pavilion, which had been here previously since 1964. Burley also has a cricket club and it's just a stone's throw away. This is much older than the Bowls Club, having been in existence since the 1850s. The club has played in the Airedale and Wharfedale League since 1908. It led something of a nomadic life before 1924. The club have played at various locations, including Victoria Park, which is the one next to the Scout Hut, and Walton Park, situated where the Generous Pioneer used to be. Even the ground in nearby Menston was used for a season after World War I. They finally settled at Hodson Park in 1924. At that time, the park occupied a much larger site and was also the home ground of a football club, Burley and Wharfedale AFC. Now, so far we've not seen any schools, but we have mentioned a couple. This here is Burley Oak School, which is the main one in the village today. Burley's school history is extremely complicated, so much so I'm going to have to do this in two parts. There were once several of them dotted all over the place. The earliest recorded day school in Burley was the Township School, which was built in 1817 and originally occupied part of the Mechanics Institute site at the junction of Main Street and Station Road. That was demolished by Thomas Emsley in the 1860s and replaced with a new school building behind the terraced houses next to the chemists on Main Street. On Main Street there's a listed building which is often referred to as the Old Grammar School, despite the fact there's no hard evidence that it ever was one. The design, however, is similar to other school buildings of the 17th and 18th centuries. It served as the parish rooms for many years. Okay, here's where it starts to get a bit more sparse. We'll talk a bit more about the school history with Burley in a few moments' time, but between here and the other school, there's the railway station, and it's quite a walk away. (1865) was a very important year for Burley. In that year, the Otley and Ilkley Joint Railway Line and Burley Railway Station were opened. By the early 1900s, the station would have employed around 13 staff working in 2 shifts. There would have been a station master and his assistant, and on each shift a booking clerk, a goods clerk, a parcel porter, 2 platform porters and a signalman. The station dealt with goods as well as passengers. In fact, there were goods sidings on the site of the current houses at the Robins. The station became very popular and by the 1920s saw as many as 60 trains a day stopping here. At the time, the line ran to Bolton Abbey and members of the royal family would pass through the station on their way to join shooting parties there. As road traffic increased, the line's importance for goods and passengers declined. In 1963, the whole of the line was slated for closure. 2 years later, all that remained were the Ilkley to Bradford and Leeds sections, which became known as the Wharfedale line. The station buildings were closed and then demolished in 1973. The line, though, is still active and Burley Station is still going. Electrification came to the line in 1995, but the old-fashioned slam-door carriages continued to be used on its trains until 2001. Here's part 2 of the school history. As well as the ones we've already mentioned, other schools in Burley included one within Greenholme Mills, which later moved to Queen's Hall, and a Church of England National School on Airville Terrace that was built in 1898. The latter replaced a previous one on Back Lane dating from 1837. There were others too, probably too many to list. Thankfully today it's a bit easier to understand. In 1950, all of the old schools were combined into one, and most children then went to Airville Terrace. That's not the case today though. Burley Oaks is now the main school in the village after Airville Terrace's site was sold off in the year 2000 and its buildings and grounds became housing. Burley and Woodhead, this building here, is now the only alternative. This replaced a former school at Burley Woodhead, a small hamlet we'll be driving through later. We're almost all the way around this route now. We've been going quite a while. Our penultimate landmark is a Catholic church. In post-Reformation times, there were very small numbers of recusant Catholics in Burley. In fact, in 1614, there were only 5. However, in the 1700s, a Benedictine mission at Middleton Lodge in Ilkley became a local centre of growth. In 1791, the position was improved by the Relief Act, and the Emancipation Act of 1829 finally gave Roman Catholics full recognition under the law. By the early 1900s, providing sufficient numbers of churches and priests was a challenge. Burley was originally served by a single church in Otley, which covered 90 square miles. In 1930, Burley gained its own building. It was a notable one too. It was the first church in England to be dedicated to the martyrs Thomas More and John Fisher, who were canonised 3 years later. Fast forward to 1980, and now that church has become a thriving centre of worship for the local Catholic population of the district. Much of the fabric was renewed at the end of that decade, and both the church and a new altar were consecrated in October 1989. Okay, on foot we've got one final stretch. This will take us across Burley House Field and back to the beginning, close to the church and pudding tree and all that kind of stuff that we started with. Seems a long time ago, doesn't it? Lastly, on foot at least, we have effectively another huge park. This was once parkland that belonged to a mansion, Burley House. Burley House is the only Grade 1 listed building in the village. The house was once occupied by William Rouse Jr. and his family. He was the owner of William Rouse & Sons, a large worsted spinner in Bradford, and as you'd expect, he had a bob or two. Also living with him were his wife, 5 children and 6 servants, including a governess from Devon and a footman. Rouse was related to Thomas Emsley. In fact, Emsley even lived at Burley House before buying the Grange. The 1871 census shows Mrs. Rouse as widowed and lists the sons as having entered their father's business. It's also interesting to note a visitor resident at the time, an army captain from the West Indies. In later years, the house became a private school, then a hotel, then a restaurant, and then office space. It was converted to apartments in 2018, and that's the way it's stayed ever since. And we are back to the beginning, just over 2 hours since we began. And the sun is definitely up now, isn't it? Looks quite nice, does Burley, in the sunshine. Let's see how nice it looks when we get in the car and have a little drive around, because we're not quite done with this yet. We need to drive through the village to some other areas, including Calibur Park, which used to be a hospital. The rest of this episode will be covered using the car. We've walked a really long way, but despite that, the size of modern-day Burley is immense. There are housing estates all over the place, and the population reflects that fact. It's well in excess of 7,000. In recent times, brand new estates have been built on the edge of the village. Here, I'm taking you to one in particular, which has a bit of history to it. This is Calibur Park. It's built on part of the former Calibur Park Hospital, which in turn was built on part of the estate of the old Calibur Hall. The hospital housed 210 fee-paying psychiatric patients, 105 of each sex. The property covered 120 acres. It was also known as the West Riding Private Asylum, or Calibur Park Asylum, and was opened by the West Riding County Council in 1902. It was designed by J. Vickers Edwards, the county architect for the West Riding of Yorkshire, and it was built by Isaac Gould of Leeds. It even had its own branch siding from the Otley and Ilkley Joint Railway, which was built to aid its construction. The loco that was used was owned by Isaac Gould. It was called Hannah, and it was named after his wife. I found a brilliant website which is linked below that shows a lot of images of Calibur. Go check it out, it's fascinating stuff. Now, before we get to Burley Woodhead, we need to cover Burley Moore. This is a massive area of peatland that dominates the western side of the parish. To look at it on the map, you'd think there's nothing there. You'd be very, very wrong. Burley Moore is known for at least 2 landmarks. One of them is the 12 Apostles Stone Circle. The circle is on the edge of the moor, in an area known more locally as Rombolds Moor. With a diameter of about 15 metres, the circle originally had between 16 and 20 stones, but there are now only 12. The stones are made from the local millstone grit. At the centre of the circle was a small mound which may have been the disturbed remains of a burial cairn. The circle used to lie inside a bank which was still traceable in the 1920s, but has apparently eroded away since, thanks to visitors walking over the ground. In fact, visitor erosion is so severe here that the site is now an area of bare trampled soil. That's quite amazing when you consider it used to be hidden beneath some moorland heather. It's regarded as one of the most damaged prehistoric sites in West Yorkshire. The precise purpose of the circle is unknown, though in all likelihood it was ritualistic. The site was surveyed in 1929 by Arthur Raystrick, who stated that its position suggests very strongly that it's purely a burial mound and the stones are just add-ons. Others have speculated that rather than a fully fledged stone circle, it may have been a type of ring cairn instead. The other well-known feature on the moor is the Ashlar Chair. This is essentially two large boulders which aren't all that far from the 12 Apostles. You can walk between the two with relative ease. The Ashlar Chair, according to folklore, is a relic of Druidism. Indeed, it used to be known by some as the Druids' Chair instead. In the 19th century it also became known as the Etching Stone, but it's retained its present title for more than 200 years. Shaped more like a couch than a chair, the Ashlar is important in ritual Freemasonry, which has two aspects to it. These are known as the rough and the perfect. Oaths are sworn on the Ashlar and laws are spoken from it. The land which lays before it is called the Square, a stretch of open moorland that covers about 396 square yards. The Square is also one of the most important elements of Freemasonry, representing the manifest universe. Geographically, the Ashlar Chair is the meeting point of Bingley, Burley, Moreton and Ilkley Moors, and metaphorically speaking, when you stand here, you are outside the confines of the four worlds, yet still a purveyor of them. Apparently. Burley Moor has often attracted meteorologists as well as tourists, thanks mainly to a weather phenomenon known as the Brocken Spectre. This occurs when it's foggy and the observer is above the fog with the sun behind them. That creates a shadowy figure on the fog itself. The phenomenon is normally associated with mountains, but occurs on Burley Moor because of the local geography and weather conditions. These same conditions often produce fog at Leeds Bradford Airport, 2.5 miles away to the south. Burley Woodhead is 1 mile to the southwest of Burley and Wharfedale. Chiefly, this is a small cluster of farms and houses along the road from Ilkley to Guiseley at the foot of Burley Moor. It contains a pub too, called the Hermit. Between 1832 and 1976, the hamlet had its own school too, but we already know about that. It's now a private residence, as is the former Wesleyan Chapel, which dates from 1867. To the west of the hamlet are some former quarry workings, the face of which is now used by climbers. Carr Beck runs through the southern half of the hamlet and it's a tributary of the River Wharfe. The beck is dammed and forms Carr Bottom Reservoir, which is not used as a drinking supply but as a compensation reservoir instead. Burley Woodhead is perhaps best known, however, for being the home of the much loved and sorely missed television presenter Richard Whiteley until his death in 2005. For those of you who don't know who he was the man that presented the long-running Channel 4 tea time quiz show, Countdown. And with Burley Woodhead driven through, that brings us to the end of this trip around Burley Parish. Now, Scalibur might have been a well-known hospital in these parts, but tomorrow I'm going to take you to a place which had a much more famous one. If there's any Kaiser Chief fans out there, you won't want to miss the next episode, I'll tell thee. See you tomorrow. just before I go, remember, this video is part of a huge project to visit every civil parish in England. That's more than 10,000. These routes are pre-planned, and due to time constraints, I can't cover every detail or walk down every street. Please don't complain if this video missed something out. I pronounce names how I choose to. I am very aware that local dialect may vary, and I don't take kindly to criticism about this. You've been warned. It's impossible to know everything too. If this video was terrible, make your own. If you're a regular watcher of The Village Idiot, you're not the only one. If you've got a small business, why not use my videos to advertise it? Leave a comment below if you're interested. And finally, thanks for watching this episode, everybody. Give us a like and a subscribe if you've enjoyed this episode, and share it with your friends and relatives. It all helps to keep this mission going. Until next time, I've been Andy, also known as The Village Idiot, and I'm out.